Jeff, really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for not postponing or canceling, given what we're seeing in the markets today.
Yeah, what is it? Everybody's calling it QE light. Yield curve control. There's a whole bunch of names and acronyms being thrown around here.
Yeah, we'll have to get to the bottom of it. Maybe we'll start bit with a setup. Yields have been rising dramatically, especially on the long end. We've seen yields over 530.
530, yeah.
Right? And the Treasury Department blinked this morning. Maybe you want to set the scene for us, because you can probably do a way better job explaining what happened over the last 24 hours than I can.
Well, first of all, I think to be contrarian here, the market isn't really soaring and rates are not rising quickly. In fact, we went through this just a couple years ago. When the 30-year Treasury bond hit 5% for the first time in October of 2023, you heard all the same noises and talking, and everybody went crazy about it. The 30-year bond is the highest it's been since 2007, exactly the same as what we're hearing today. There was a horrific 30-year long bond auction in early November 2023. It was inflation. The Fed was losing control. The government was out of control, which, by the way, is absolutely true. The government is definitely out of control, and so are interest expenses. Those things that was true. But when the 30-year long bond hit 5%, everybody said, okay, here it comes. Rates are going to have to go to 6, 7. I mean, Jamie Dimon was out there, so, head of JP Morgan, saying we got to get ready for 7% Fed funds yields. And therefore that would mean, the 30-year somewhere around 8, 9, 10%. And what happened? Absolutely nothing. Bonds instead went lower. The 30-year yield has been rising pretty steadily. I won't say substantially, because it really hasn't been substantially since that time. When everybody went crazy, the long bond is sending this massive signal because it's above 5% for the first time since 2007. Since that time, 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, the 30-year long bond rate is about 25 basis points higher than it was 3 years ago. So that was not a signal that interest rates were soaring. Instead, what it was everybody making a big deal out of a round number that was never backed up by the rest of the bond market and the rest of the yield curve. When you actually looked at what the yield curve was saying, it was saying that, yes, interest rates are rising, but they're being pressured higher by the short end, which is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve raising rates above where the market thought that they should be. So the yield curve being inverted at the time suggested that, okay, however high rates get in the short run, 5%, maybe it would be 6%. We don't know. They were going to go down afterward, or at the very least, they were not going to skyrocket like everybody said. And it wasn't just the yield curve. You had all sorts of related signals and interest rate swaps and other forms of swaps and derivatives too, forward rate markets. All of it said that there really wasn't any signal in the 30-year long bond crossing 5%. Fast forward 3 years, and while the yield curve is no longer inverted because the Federal Reserve realized that the bond market was right back then and has been cutting rates, however, slowly and incrementally since then, the bond market position has not actually changed. And the reason why the 30-year rate is rising now to 531 as it was on Monday was simply that, again, the Federal Reserve is in the way. The yield curve wants to uninvert and normalize. However, the Federal Reserve is not acting the way it does in normal cycles, which is to get the hell out of the way of the bond market and cut short-term rates where they would actually be if there was no Federal Reserve. But since the curve wants to steepen out with the Fed sitting on the short end the way it is, the steepening is pressuring long-term yields higher, not skyrocketing. They're not parabolic. They're just moving higher in a slow, steady fashion. But then you look around the rest of the yield curve, and the rest of the yield curve says, just like it did in 2023, really nothing has changed. If we were talking about, for example, which everybody does, the fact that a lot of calculations show that the U.S. government's outstanding debt hit 40 trillion, I think yesterday, the day before, it's very likely we're at 40 trillion debt, which is absolutely astronomical. That part, you understand where people are coming from. We should not have that much debt. And yes, it is a huge problem, but no, it is not a huge problem for the Treasury marketplace. And we know that for a couple of different reasons, including the 30-year long bond and its spread over other maturities. For example, the 30-year to 10-year. If the market was saying if the market was saying this 40 trillion in outstanding debt, which is only going to continue to get higher, was a problem for the Treasury market, then what we would be seeing is the marketplace demanding additional return and additional premium for owning a 30-year long bond, say, compared to the 10-year. Forget about the front end of the yield curve. So we would see the spread between the 10-year yield and the 30-year yield dramatically rise. We would see it rise a couple hundred basis points. And it would do so very quickly. It wouldn't do so a little bit at a time here. Instead, what we're seeing is the 10-year, 30-year spread is historically narrow. Let me say that again. Historically narrow. It's about 100 basis points when, go back to the early 2010s, it was 400 basis points. So the market is not demanding additional premium to own a 30-year long bond. It's especially when you compare it to short end rates. The difference between the 3-month bill and the 30-year bond is also historically narrow. In other words, the yield curve is historically flat, which is, again, the same sort of setup that we got in 2023. So what is happening is simply that people are panicking over a 30-year long bond that has hit its highest yield in 2007, which is something we've seen before repeatedly, and turning something that really isn't a signal into trying to make it into a signal because they have a preferred narrative that they want to send.
Absolutely. I come from the gold space, and I want to see no hike, for example. I don't want to see the bond market pressure the Fed into doing something they might regret later. Do you see the bond market exerting pressure here on the Fed, like to maybe take it that direction here?
Sure. I think that's, you look at the 2-year rate or even forward rates look, ever since the beginning of the energy shock, the forward rate curve has been a frown, which is that there is some possibility the Fed hikes because the Fed doesn't understand inflation and thinks oil prices are inflationary when they're exactly the opposite, which the market knows, which is why the curve looks like it does. So the market says, there's a very good chance the Fed does hike rates, but they're only going to hike rates once, maybe twice at most, before they have to turn around and cut all over again. In fact, we already saw the ECB do the same damn thing. The Fed is very close to making the same mistake back in 2008 that the ECB did. Same setup. Oil prices are not inflationary. They're exactly the opposite, especially in an economy that's as weak as this. So as I just went through with the yield curve dynamic, the flat yield curve is the market saying, whatever the Fed does in the near term, it all leads to lower interest rates. And then you look at other markets like interest rate swaps, they have never changed their position no matter what. From last year to this year, there's been a little bit of a fluctuation in swap spreads, but the market is saying that interest rates are going to go down over time, even if we don't know exactly how much time it's going to take to get there or the exact path that the market as well as the Federal Reserve will take on the way toward that destination. And the reason is very simple. I mean, we have a weak economy. We've got labor market that's shedding jobs, depending on which statistics you use. The amount of job shedding could be substantial. The household survey is a complete and utter mess, whereas the establishment survey is only losing some jobs, which everybody just now ignores as if that's normal. But a weak job market plus higher gasoline prices that are probably going to stay high for quite some time, you're not going to get inflation. You're going to get more unemployment. Even if it's not mass waves of layoffs like most people imagine with a recession, the market is consistently pricing, really going back to 2022, consistently pricing weak economic fundamentals that, however long it takes, the Federal Reserve will eventually respond to and react to, even if they detour along the way with their pauses or maybe even a rate hike here in 2026. From October 9th through 12th, I'm bringing together a group of roughly 40 serious investors and financial professionals, along with some special guests and friends like Hugh Hendry and Mike Green, George Gammon, Brent Johnson, and a couple of other ones, where we're going to spend 4 days asking the questions that truly matter. What happens next? Where are the biggest risks being mispriced? Where are the opportunities? What should change our minds? And how should we think about positioning around it? This is not a conference built around speeches. It's a small room built around discussion, some disagreement, and actionable advice. So if you manage some meaningful capital or you're seriously interested in all of these questions and finding answers to them in a very small, intimate setting, apply below.